Everyone in this quiet street thought his story was already over, until the day a stranger moved in next door and changed everything. She built an empire out of never needing anyone, but she had no idea this street was about to break every rule she lived by. One broken fence, one impossible woman, and the beginning of a story neither of them saw coming. He said it as a joke. She answered like she meant it, and in that one moment, everything between them changed forever. She had everything money could buy, except the one thing she never knew she needed. Watch how far love will go to find its way home.
If you have ever stood on your own front porch and felt like a stranger was watching your whole life fall apart, then stay with me until the very end, because what happened between a broke, single father and the coldest CEO in the city is going to remind you that love always finds the most unexpected door to knock on. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story gets better with every single minute, and I promise you will not want to miss the ending. Daniel Hart was 37 years old, and most mornings he woke up before the sun with sawdust still caught in the creases of his hands. He was a contractor, tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair that always needed a trim, and pale blue eyes that had seen more grief than any man his age should carry. 4 years earlier, his wife Emily had died in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway, leaving him alone with their daughter Lily, who was 4 at the time and was now 8, all elbows and missing teeth, and a stubborn laugh that sounded exactly like her mother's. Their house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a modest but proud neighborhood, the kind of street where everyone knew everyone, where lawns were mowed on Saturdays and porch lights stayed on for trick-or-treaters. Daniel had built half the additions on that street himself, trading labor for rent when money was tight, which was more often than he liked to admit. He loved his daughter fiercely, worked himself to exhaustion, and had long ago stopped believing that anything good could still find him. Then, on a gray Tuesday in October, a moving truck rolled up to the vacant house next door, and everything changed. Victoria Hale stepped out of a black SUV in a tailored charcoal coat, sunglasses pushed up into dark hair pulled back in a severe knot, talking into her phone, with the clipped authority of someone who had never once been told no. She was 34, the CEO of Hale Textiles, a company she had built from a single rented sewing floor into a name whispered in boardrooms across the country. She was sharp, exacting, and utterly unused to silence. And yet she had bought the house next to Daniel's on what her assistant Renee called, quite bluntly, an impulse she could not explain even to herself. Daniel noticed her, the way anyone notices a storm cloud rolling over a calm sky, impossible to ignore, faintly unsettling, and strangely beautiful. Their first real conversation happened because of a fence. Victoria's movers had knocked loose 2 boards on the shared property line, and she marched, over in heels, sinking into his half-mowed lawn, to demand it be fixed immediately. "You could say please," Daniel said, wiping his hands on a rag. Unbothered by her tone, in a way that seemed to annoy her more than any argument would have. "I could," Victoria said, "but I find results come faster without it." He fixed the fence anyway, because that was who he was. And when he was done, she surprised him by bringing over a cup of coffee she'd made too strong. An apology disguised as caffeine. It became, without either of them planning it, a habit. She left for the office before dawn, in blazers that cost more than his truck, and came home late, smelling of boardrooms and ambition. And somewhere in between, she started noticing the small things. How Daniel always had grease under his nails, but never raised his one. At his daughter, how Lily left dandelions on Victoria's porch step because, the girl declared, "You look like you need a flower more than anybody I've ever met." Daniel's best friend Marcus, a stocky electrician with a laugh that could rattle windows, teased him mercilessly about the new neighbor from the very first week. "A CEO, Danny," he said one evening over beers on the tailgate of Daniel's truck. "In a house that size, and you're over there fixing her fence for free like some kind of catalog cover model." Daniel told him to shut up and handed him another beer, but Marcus wasn't wrong that something about the whole arrangement felt like it was tilting toward a story neither of them had written. Yet, Marcus had known Daniel since high school, had been the one to drive him to the hospital the night Emily died, had watched his friend fold grief into work the way other men folded it into bottles, and he promised himself a long time ago that if he ever saw a flicker of light come back into Daniel's, he wouldn't let his friend talk himself out of it. Daniel's mother, Carol, a soft-spoken widow who lived 20 minutes across town, and came by every Sunday to fuss over Lily's hair and Daniel's empty refrigerator, noticed the change too. She saw it in the way her son mentioned Victoria's name, twice in one sentence without meaning to. The way he'd started keeping a second coffee mug on the counter, without admitting why. "You don't have to explain her to me," Carol told him one Sunday afternoon, kneading dough at his kitchen counter. "I just want to see you happy, Daniel. Emily would want that too. Grief doesn't ask you to be alone forever. It only asks you to be honest about what you're feeling." It was Lily, more than anyone, who cracked something open in Victoria. The girl had no filter, no sense of the wall Victoria had spent 15 years building around herself, and she simply climbed over it with muddy sneakers and endless questions. "Do you have a mommy who yells at you when you're late?" Lily asked one afternoon, and Victoria, startled, admitted that she had no one at all who waited for her to come home. That confession sat heavier on Victoria than she expected. Her own childhood had been a parade of nannies and empty dinner tables. Her father, a distant, demanding man named Robert Hale, who had taught her that love was a transaction, and weakness a liability. She had built her company as both an escape and a monument, determined to become so powerful that no one could ever make her feel small again. And it had worked, mostly, until she watched Daniel patch a bicycle tire at midnight, because his widowed daughter was too anxious to sleep without knowing it would be fixed by morning. And something in Victoria's carefully constructed chest ached with a longing she didn't have a name for. Victoria's assistant, Renee, had worked beside her for 6 years and had never once seen her boss leave the office before dark, let alone smile at her phone, the way she'd started doing on Friday evenings. Renee was sharp-eyed and endlessly loyal, the only person inside Hale Textiles who dared to speak to Victoria like a human being instead of a title. "You're doing the thing," Renee said one afternoon, catching Victoria checking her phone for the third time in an hour during a supplier call. "What thing?" Victoria said, not looking up. "The thing where Victoria Hale, Ice Queen of the Garment District, actually looks forward to going home," Renee said, and Victoria, for once, didn't have a sharp comeback ready. Their friendship deepened through small kindnesses. Daniel taught Victoria how to grill without setting off the smoke alarm. Victoria, in turn, quietly paid off a delinquent supply invoice for Daniel's contracting business after she overheard him on the phone, jaw tight, begging a supplier for one more week, though she never told him because she understood, better than anyone, how much pride a person could have wrapped up in not needing rescue. It was at Lily's school fall festival, both of them standing awkwardly by a folding table of cider and cupcakes, because Lily had signed them up as her family for the parent volunteer sheet without asking either of them, that Daniel made the joke that would haunt them both. Victoria was laughing, a real laugh, rare and unguarded, cider on her lips, hair falling loose from its knot for once. And Daniel looked at her and said, without thinking too hard about it, "You know, Victoria Hale, you'd make a great bride someday." He meant it as nothing, as the kind of throwaway compliment men make when a woman looks unexpectedly soft and happy. But Victoria went still, and then she smiled, slow and unreadable, and said, "I would need a groom for that." The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward that neither of them could stop. Daniel laughed it off, mumbled something about cupcakes, and Victoria let him. But that night, lying awake in a house too large and too quiet, she turned the moment over and over, wondering why a man in flannel with a battered truck had rattled her more than any executive who had ever tried. Complications, of course, arrived exactly when things felt most fragile. Grant Whitfield, the vice chairman of Hale Textiles Board, had spent 2 years angling to either merge the company under his control or force Victoria out entirely, and he saw her growing distraction, her lateness, her softened edges, the way she left the office at 6 instead of 9, as opportunity. He began quietly courting other board members, whispering that Victoria had lost her focus, that a founder in love was a founder who could be replaced. Victoria, blindsided by a boardroom vote scheduled with barely any warning, threw herself back into work with a vengeance, pulling away from Daniel and Lily overnight, canceling a promised trip to the zoo, letting calls go unanswered. Daniel, who had lost one woman already to circumstances beyond his control, recognized the retreat for what it felt like, abandonment, and it cut deeper than he expected. He told himself it was fine, that he had no right to expect anything from a woman like Victoria Hale anyway, that men who fixed fences for a living didn't end up with CEOs no matter what a foolish joke at a fall festival might have suggested. He threw himself into work too, taking every job he could find, exhausting himself so he wouldn't have to feel the specific quiet that had crept back into his kitchen once Victoria's porch light stopped meaning anything. Making matters worse, Lily's second-grade teacher, a kind but overly attentive young woman named Sophie, who had made no secret of her fondness for Daniel at pickup time, chose that same stretch of weeks to invite him to a parent-teacher fundraiser as something closer to a date than woman. Marcus, hearing about it, pushed Daniel to go, arguing that a man couldn't wait around forever for a CEO who kept canceling on his daughter. Daniel almost agreed. He went to the fundraiser, stood stiffly through punch and small talk, and realized within 20 minutes that his mind kept drifting 3 streets over to a dark house with an unlit porch, light, and that no amount of Sophie's kindness could compete with the ache of missing someone who was supposed to be right next door. He came home early, and Lily, far too perceptive for 8, asked him only one question: "Do you still like Victoria, even though she's sad and far away?" He didn't have a good answer for her that night, only a long silence, and a promise to tuck her in twice. Meanwhile, Grant Whitfield escalated. He leaked a quiet rumor to 2 industry reporters, suggesting Hale Textiles was distracted and rudderless under Victoria's leadership, timing it to rattle nervous shareholders right before the vote. Renee intercepted the story before it printed and brought it straight to Victoria's wall desk at 11 at night. The two of them poring over spreadsheets and phone logs trying to trace the leak. And it was in that exhausted, adrenaline-soaked hour that Victoria finally admitted out loud, to someone other than herself, that she was more frightened of losing Daniel and Lily than she had ever been of losing the company her whole identity was built on. "Then stop losing them," Renee said simply, closing her laptop. "Spreadsheets you can win back. People leave for good." Lily was the one who refused to let the silence stand. She wrote Victoria a letter in crayon, misspelled and devastating, asking why she didn't come over anymore, and whether it was because Lily had done something wrong. Victoria read it standing in her glass-walled office, 40 floors above the city, Grant Whitfield's latest memo still open on her monitor, and she began to cry for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not because of the board, not because of the merger threat, but because an 8-year-old girl had asked the one question Victoria had spent her whole adult life avoiding: whether she was capable of staying. She drove home that night, still in her work clothes, and stood on Daniel's ways. The way she had the very first week, except this time, there was no fence to argue about, only the truth. Her hands were shaking when he opened the door, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. The porch light throwing long shadows across the steps, while somewhere behind Daniel, Lily peeked around the hallway corner in her pajamas, holding her breath. Victoria told him everything, about Grant, about the leaked story, about the vote scheduled for the following week, about the father who taught her love was leverage, and the mother who had left before Victoria was old enough to remember her face. She told him how terrified she had been the moment she realized that a widowed contractor and his little girl had become the only place in her life that felt like home, and how that terror was exactly why she'd pulled away instead of leaning in, because every person who had ever mattered to Victoria Hale had eventually been a line item in someone's calculation, and she couldn't bear the thought of becoming that to Daniel too. Daniel, who had spent 4 years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, listened to a woman worth more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes admit she was afraid of losing. A house with a crooked fence, and a girl who left dandelions on her steps, and he understood, finally, that some things were never about money at all. He didn't lecture her. didn't ask her to choose between the company and them. He just pulled her into the kitchen, made her the same too-strong coffee she'd once made him, and let Lily, who had abandoned all pretense of staying in bed, climb into her lap and declare that she'd been saving a dandelion for a whole week, just in case Victoria ever came back. Victoria cried again, quietly this time, and Daniel sat across the table and simply let her. Because some nights, the kindest thing a person can offer is not solving anything, only staying. They talked until almost 2 in the morning, working through what the vote would mean, what Grant might try next, whether Victoria even wanted to keep fighting for a company that had started to feel like a cage built from her father's expectations. It was Daniel, of all people, who convinced her not to walk away. "You didn't build that company for him," he said. "You built it so nobody could ever again make you feel like you weren't enough. Don't hand him the one thing you built with your own 2 hands, just because he's trying to scare you into it." Victoria looked at this man in a paint-stained t-shirt, giving her better counsel at midnight than any consultant on her payroll ever had, and something settled in her chest that felt, for the first time in years, like certainty. The days before the vote stretched long and tense. Grant Whitfield made one final move, calling an emergency dinner with 3 swing board members at a private club downtown, hoping to lock their votes before Victoria could counter. Renee found out through a junior analyst who owed her a favor and called Victoria in a panic at 9 at night. Victoria's first instinct, honed over 15 years of boardroom warfare, was to go straight to the club and fight fire with fire. Daniel talked her down, not because he doubted her, but because he'd learned something from years of underbidding richer contractors. Sometimes, the strongest move was refusing to play the game on your opponent's terms. Instead, Victoria spent that night drafting a plain, honest letter to every board member. No legal polish, no spin, just the truth about the company's numbers, her vision for its future, and an acknowledgement that she had, for a few weeks, let her attention slip, followed by exactly why and exactly what she intended to do about it. Renee delivered it by hand to every doorstep before sunrise. The board vote came a week later, and Victoria walked in expecting a fight and found something else waiting. Daniel, in his one good suit, sitting quietly in the back of the boardroom, and beside him, unbelievably, Robert Hale, the father she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Daniel had tracked him down, not to fix anything between them, he said, but because he believed everyone deserved the chance to show up, even late, even imperfectly, the way Victoria had shown up on his porch. Robert didn't say much, but he stood when the vote was called and reminded the board, in a voice that cracked more than Victoria had ever heard it crack, that Hale Textiles carried his daughter's name for a reason, and that reason wasn't Grant Whitfield's spreadsheet projections. The vote went Victoria's way, narrowly, decisively enough. Grant resigned within the month, rather than face the shareholders he'd tried to turn. But the boardroom victory mattered less to Victoria than what happened after, when she found Daniel waiting by his truck in the parking garage, instead of celebrating with the board, because he'd told her days earlier that whatever happened in that room, he only cared about what happened on the other side of it. "You came," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean. Not even jokes." She looked at him for a long moment, the city lights bouncing off the concrete, and asked if he remembered what he'd said to her at the fall festival. He said he remembered every word. She stepped closer and told him that she had spent 34 years building a life that needed no one, and that he and his daughter had somehow become the only 2 people she couldn't survive losing, and that if the offer still stood, she'd very much like to discuss the matter of a groom. They married the following spring in Daniel's backyard, under a string of cafe lights he'd hung himself over 3 consecutive weekends, insisting no electrician but him would touch a single strand near his own wedding. Lily served as flower girl and ring bearer both, because she flatly refused to share the job with anyone, and marched down the makeshift aisle of folding chairs with a seriousness that made the whole yard laugh through their tears. Robert Hale walked his daughter halfway down the aisle before stepping back, by mutual agreement, to let Daniel meet her the rest of the way himself. A small, symbolic handoff that said more about how far both Victoria and her father had come than either of them. could have put into words. Marcus, Daniel's oldest friend and reluctant best man, cried more than anyone expected and blamed it loudly on the pollen count. Renee, Victoria's assistant, cried harder still, clutching a bouquet of dandelions Lily had insisted on weaving into the arrangement despite the florist's protests. Carol, Daniel's mother, held Lily's hand throughout the ceremony and whispered that Emily would have loved this, would have loved Victoria, would have been so proud of the man her son had become, even in his grief. Even Sophie the teacher came, seated near the back, and told Daniel afterward with genuine warmth that she was glad Yves had found his way home to someone who made him look the way he did that day. Lighter, unguarded, entirely himself. There was no fairy tale ending, in the sense of problems disappearing. Victoria still ran a company, still faced hard days in boardrooms, and Daniel still worked with his hands and worried about invoices. Grant Whitfield's name still occasionally surfaced in industry gossip, a cautionary tale about board members who mistook a founder's humanity for weakness. Sophie eventually found someone of her own and sent a genuinely kind card to the wedding. Robert Hale started showing up for Sunday dinners, awkward at first, then less so, teaching Lily chess with a patience he'd never once shown his own daughter, as if he were quietly trying to get right in his granddaughter's life what he'd comment so wrong in his own child's. But every evening, no matter how the day had gone, there was a porch light on, a girl waiting with muddy sneakers and endless questions, and a man who had learned that love doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to. Sometimes it moves in next door in a black SUV, complains about a broken fence, and teaches you that the bravest thing anyone can do is let themselves be needed again. And sometimes, if you are patient enough, and honest enough, and brave enough to answer a foolish joke with the truest thing you've ever said, it turns out the groom was standing on the other side of the fence all along. If this story moved you even a little, remember that the people who seem the most unreachable are often just waiting for someone patient enough to fix what's broken and stay. Thank you for watching until the end. And if you believe love can still surprise us in the most ordinary places, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a second chance.